January 1945. Sandakan POW Camp, British North Borneo. The stench of sickness hung in the humid air, heavy enough to taste. Rain hammered the camp without pause, drumming on patched palm leaf roofs and running in dirty streams beneath the bamboo floors. Inside the barracks, men lay shoulder to shoulder in darkness. Bones under skin, eyes too large for their faces, breaths shallow and uneven. Some coughed until they retched. Others did not move at all. A prisoner named William Stickpowich listened to the sounds outside long before he saw anything. Boots splashed through mud. Voices rose, short commands, sharper than usual. Then the rattle of a rifle bolt. The guards did not shout like this on ordinary mornings. For 3 years, the camp had followed a brutal rhythm. Forced labor, beatings, sickness, hunger, and the slow reduction of men into shadows. This morning, that rhythm changed. Stickpowich edged toward a gap in the wall where the bamboo had split. Through it, he watched Japanese guards gather in the open, rain streaking down their helmets. One officer held a list protected under his tunic. Another carried a stick and used it to point, not at buildings or tools, but at men. They began calling names. At first, the prisoners did not understand what the selection meant. Some thought it might be a work party, another airfield task, another day of carrying stones or clearing jungle. But the guards were looking at bodies the way a butcher judged meat. Men who could still stand were dragged outside. Those who could walk without help were pushed into a separate group. The weakest, men with swollen legs from beriberi, men blinded by malnutrition, men with tropical ulcers that never healed, were ordered to stay behind. In the barracks, a few prisoners tried to sit up, desperate to look strong. Others did not even attempt it. They knew their own limits. Many had not had a full meal in months. Some weighed less than a child. The rain hid nothing. Weakness was obvious in every movement. Stickpowich felt the shift in the camp like a cold weight in the chest. If they were moving men, it was not for mercy. Sandakan had never offered mercy. The Japanese had forced prisoners to build an airstrip under starvation rations, and sickness had done the rest. But this was different. This looked planned, deliberate, a step towards something final. A guard walked along the line, stopping to prod a prisoner's ribs with the stick, as if checking whether the man was alive enough to be useful. Another guard laughed when a prisoner stumbled. The officer with the list nodded, and the stumbling man was shoved back toward the barracks. It was then Stickpowich understood what the separation truly meant. Those who could still walk were being taken somewhere. In their condition, a journey was not an evacuation. It was a sentence. If the camp itself had already killed men by the hundreds, a march through Borneo's interior would finish the job. The prisoners did not yet know the destination. They did not know the distance. They did not know the orders given to the guards. But they sensed what was coming, the way a dying man senses the next wave of fever. Within weeks, this selection would lead to one of the most lethal death marches of the Second World War. More than 2,000 Australian and British prisoners would vanish into jungle and mountains. Only 6 would live long enough to tell anyone what happened next. By early 1945, the Pacific War had turned decisively against Japan. American forces had returned to the Philippines under General Douglas MacArthur. Major naval bases across the Pacific were back in Allied hands. Long-range bombers struck shipping lanes and airfields throughout Southeast Asia. Japanese supply routes were collapsing under submarine attacks. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft lacked spare parts. Garrisons across the region were increasingly isolated. Borneo still mattered. The island held oil fields vital to Japan's shrinking war machine. Refineries at Balikpapan and surrounding regions provided fuel that Tokyo could not afford to lose. Sandakan, on the northeastern coast of British North Borneo, had once been a useful military outpost. Its airstrip offered regional coverage. Its harbour supported local shipping. But by January 1945, Sandakan stood exposed. Allied aircraft operated within range. Japanese forces there were cut off from consistent reinforcement or evacuation. Inside this deteriorating strategic position stood one of the largest concentrations of Australian prisoners held by Japan. Approximately 2,700 Australian and British soldiers had been transported to Sandakan between 1942 and 1943. Most were men of the Australian 8th Division, captured after the fall of Singapore. They had survived the shock of defeat, the chaos of imprisonment, and the sea voyage north under appalling conditions. At Sandakan, they were forced into labour building and repairing the airfield for Japanese military use. From Tokyo's perspective, prisoners were no longer a priority asset. They were a burden. By 1945, the airstrip had been repeatedly damaged by Allied bombing. Food supplies to the camp had been reduced to almost nothing. Japanese units in Borneo struggled to feed their own troops. The possibility that Allied forces would land on the island was growing stronger each month. Japanese command faced a problem. If Allied troops liberated Sandakan, thousands of emaciated prisoners would testify to years of forced labour, starvation, beatings, and executions. Evidence of systematic mistreatment would not remain hidden. International law, though frequently ignored by imperial forces, would be invoked after the war. Individual officers could face prosecution. Evacuation by sea was no longer realistic. Allied naval superiority made transport dangerous. Aircraft were limited. Resources were stretched thin. There were no prepared facilities elsewhere capable of housing thousands of sick prisoners. In this narrowing set of options, the prisoners were no longer viewed as men under custody. They were seen as potential witnesses. Japanese military thinking, shaped by a culture that placed surrender beyond acceptable conduct, treated captured soldiers as dishonoured. Compassion did not guide policy. Obedience and elimination of risk did. By early 1945, the garrison at Sandakan understood that holding the prisoners in place carried danger. Releasing them was unthinkable. Allowing them to be rescued was unacceptable. The decision that followed was framed as relocation. Orders were issued to move the prisoners inland, away from the coast and potential Allied landings. Official language suggested protection from bombing and improved security. In reality, no substantial preparation had been made at the intended destination. No stockpiles of food waited there. No proper shelter had been constructed. The larger strategic context made the intention clear. Japan was losing ground. Commanders were increasingly acting to destroy assets that could not be defended. Infrastructure was burned. Supplies were abandoned. In some regions, prisoners were executed outright rather than liberated. At Sandakan, a different method was chosen, one that would leave fewer obvious traces. The prisoners themselves knew little of this calculation. Cut off from outside news, weakened by disease, they relied on rumour and scraps of overheard conversation. Some still believed Allied forces would arrive in time. Others sensed that the tightening restrictions and harsher treatment signalled something worse. Unknown to them, they had already been deemed expendable. Their fate was now tied not to military necessity in any practical sense, but to a decision made in fear. Fear of accountability, fear of exposure, fear of consequences that would come when the war ended. In that environment, mercy had no place. Among the thousands confined at Sandakan were 6 men who would eventually survive. In early 1945, however, survival seemed unlikely for any of them. One of the central figures in the camp's hidden resistance was Captain Lionel Matthews. Matthews had been born in Adelaide in 1912. Before the war, he worked as a school teacher. He was educated, thoughtful, and known for his quiet discipline. Those who served with him later described him as steady under pressure, not prone to anger or panic. He carried his faith privately and rarely raised his voice. At Sandakan, Matthews became more than a prisoner. He organised an underground intelligence network inside the camp. Using smuggled components and improvised wiring, he helped assemble a secret radio receiver. Through it, fragments of Allied broadcasts reached the prisoners. News of battles in the Pacific, though incomplete, restored a measure of hope. Matthews also gathered information about Japanese troop movements and defensive positions. With the assistance of trusted prisoners, he established contact with local guerrilla fighters operating in the Borneo interior. Intelligence passed from the camp through dangerous intermediaries. The work carried certain death if discovered. Despite severe malnutrition and repeated beatings, Matthews maintained discipline among those involved. He understood the risk. If the Japanese uncovered the network, punishment would not be limited to him alone. In mid-1944, the operation was exposed. Japanese authorities discovered the radio and traced connections within the camp. Arrests followed. Matthews and several others were subjected to interrogation and torture. Witnesses later recalled hearing screams from the guardhouse that continued through the night. A formal trial was staged. The verdict was predetermined. Matthews and a group of prisoners were publicly executed as a warning. They were hanged before their fellow captives. The message was clear. Resistance would not be tolerated. The executions also hardened Japanese suspicion that prisoners possessed knowledge they could share if liberated. Matthews did not live to see the marches, yet his actions shaped what followed. The discovery of his network reinforced the belief among Japanese officers that prisoners must not fall into Allied hands alive. Another figure stood among the thousands, younger and less visible. Private Keith Botterill was 23 years old from Sydney. Before enlistment, he had worked as a clerk. He had no record of military distinction before capture. Those who knew him described him as observant rather than outspoken. At Sandakan, Botterill began recording what he saw. Using scraps of paper hidden in clothing and beneath floorboards, he wrote brief notes in small handwriting. Names of the dead, dates of punishments, details of rations, instances of execution. Each entry carried enormous risk. Discovery meant immediate death. Botterill did not present himself as a hero. He was not leading sabotage or directing escape plans. His act was preservation. He understood that memory fades and rumors distort. If no one survived with evidence, the truth could be denied. Around these individuals stood the larger body of prisoners. Most were Australian soldiers from the 8th Division, captured in Singapore in February 1942. Many had been civilians only months before the war. Clerks, labourers, farmers, teachers. Ages ranged from late teens to middle age. Few had expected prolonged captivity. By 1945, their physical condition was critical. Rations had been steadily reduced over 3 years. Rice portions fell from reasonable subsistence levels to near starvation. Diseases such as beriberi, dysentery, and malaria were widespread. Tropical ulcers ate into flesh and bone. Many men weighed under 100 pounds. Some were partially blind from vitamin deficiency. Yet even in that state, bonds remained strong. Australian soldiers shared what little food they had. They supported those too weak to stand. Humour, dark and restrained, persisted in whispers after lights out. The concept of mateship endured. No man abandoned if help could be given. Despite their condition, hope had not fully disappeared. Some believed Allied landings were imminent. They listened for distant aircraft and imagined rescue ships offshore. They did not know that Japanese commanders had already considered them liabilities rather than prisoners. Within this fragile community, worn down by hunger but still bound by loyalty, decisions were being made far beyond their control. Only 6 would live to recount what happened next. At the beginning of 1945, none could have predicted who those 6 would be. In January 1945, a formal order reached the Sandakan Camp Command. The instruction directed that the remaining prisoners were to be moved inland to Ranau, approximately 260 kilometers away. The explanation given was military necessity. Allied bombing had intensified. Coastal positions were considered vulnerable. Relocation, it was said, would ensure security. The practical details told a different story. The route to Ranau passed through dense rainforest and mountainous terrain, rising more than 4,000 feet above sea level. There were no established roads suitable for transporting large groups of weakened men. There were no vehicles allocated for prisoner movement. No significant supply caches awaited them along the way. At the time of the order, 2,434 Australian and British prisoners remained alive at Sandakan. Most were severely malnourished. Years of reduced rations had left them skeletal. Many could not stand for long without support. Beriberi had swollen legs and distorted joints. Dysentery caused constant dehydration. Untreated ulcers had penetrated to bone. Even basic footwear was scarce. Some men wore improvised sandals made from scraps of rubber or cloth. Despite this condition, each selected prisoner was expected to carry Japanese military stores, ammunition, rice sacks, equipment, often weighing up to 40 pounds. The official rice ration issued for the march was calculated for a brief journey. In reality, it was insufficient even under ideal circumstances. There were no medical provisions, no arrangements for transport of the sick, no prepared shelters at the destination. The arithmetic was clear. A 260-kilometre trek through tropical jungle required strength, endurance, and adequate nutrition. These prisoners possessed none of those. The unspoken instructions to the guards completed the picture. Any prisoner who fell behind was to be dealt with immediately. Shooting and bayoneting were standard enforcement methods. There was to be no delay for burial, no attempt to treat the injured. Those too ill to depart from Sandakan would not remain indefinitely. They would be executed later. Ranau itself offered no genuine refuge. Reports indicated that only a rough clearing existed there. Food supplies were minimal. Shelter was incomplete. The march was not a transfer between functioning camps. It was movement toward a location incapable of sustaining life. For the prisoners, refusal was not an option. Those who resisted orders faced instant punishment. Those who attempted escape risked jungle hazards and certain pursuit. Surrounding villages had suffered under Japanese occupation and feared retaliation. The rainforest extended for hundreds of kilometers without marked paths. The decision imposed on them created an impossible calculation. To march meant likely death from exhaustion, disease, or execution along the trail. To remain meant eventual killing at the camp. There was no scenario in which compliance led to safety. The situation had been shaped by years of deliberate deterioration. From 1942 onward, prisoners had been compelled to build and maintain the Sandakan airstrip. They moved earth and stone under tropical sun for 12 hours a day. Medical treatment was minimal. Rations steadily declined. Punishments for minor infractions were severe. Executions occurred as examples. The exposure of Captain Lionel Matthews's resistance network in 1944 intensified Japanese suspicion. His execution, along with others, reinforced the view that prisoners possessed dangerous knowledge. From that point forward, paranoia influenced policy. By early 1945, Japanese officers confronted the prospect of Allied landings and post-war accountability. The march to Ranau solved several concerns at once. It removed prisoners from the coast. It reduced logistical burden. And, through natural attrition in hostile terrain, it diminished the number of potential witnesses without requiring an overt mass execution at a single site. For the prisoners, the reality was simpler. They were being ordered to walk into terrain that healthy soldiers would struggle to cross, while already dying from hunger and illness. No contingency existed for their survival. The journey had been designed without regard for whether any of them would complete it. On 29 January 1945, the first column departed Sandakan. Japanese guards selected 470 prisoners considered strong enough to walk. The term was relative. Many were barely upright. Yet compared to those left behind, they appeared capable of movement without assistance. The selection process divided close friends and, in some cases, brothers. There was no opportunity for farewell beyond a glance or brief handshake. Each chosen man received a small rice ration and was assigned a load of Japanese supplies. Ammunition boxes and equipment were secured to shoulders already reduced to bone. The column moved westward. During the first days, progress was slow but orderly. The terrain near the coast was less severe. Guards maintained discipline but refrained from immediate violence. Some prisoners allowed themselves to believe the march might indeed be relocation rather than extermination. That belief did not last. By the fourth day, exhaustion became visible. Dysentery spread quickly through the column. Men staggered while attempting to maintain formation. When 3 prisoners collapsed near Pajanatan village and could not rise, guards executed them beside the trail. The bodies were left where they fell. The pace increased. Rest periods shortened. Loads remained unchanged. Feet deteriorated rapidly in the wet conditions. Without proper boots, ulcers reopened. Infections spread. Some men attempted to support weaker companions, sharing weight or guiding them across muddy slopes. These efforts slowed the column and drew punishment. As the route climbed toward mountainous terrain, the environment itself became an enemy. Steep ascents required climbing narrow paths slick with rain. Humidity remained constant, near saturation. Leeches attached to exposed skin. Streams swollen by monsoon rains had to be crossed without assistance. Every misstep risked a fall that, in their condition, could prove fatal. By early February, executions were routine. Any man unable to maintain pace was struck, and if he failed to rise, shot or bayoneted. Guards refused burial. Prisoners marched past the dead, unable to pause. Back at Sandakan, conditions worsened for those remaining. Food supplies continued to diminish. Allied bombing of nearby facilities intensified. Japanese command received confirmation that the first group had not reached Ranao intact. The majority had died en route. Despite this knowledge, a second march was ordered. On 29 May 1945, 536 additional prisoners were forced onto the same trail. These men were weaker than the first group. Many could not walk unaided even within the camp. There was no pretense of restraint now. From the beginning, shootings occurred daily. The trail itself bore evidence of the earlier march. Scattered bones and shallow graves marked the route. Prisoners recognized clothing fragments and personal items belonging to friends who had departed months earlier. Guards no longer moderated their methods. When an entire section fell behind schedule near the end of May, dozens were executed in a single afternoon. Those too weak to carry equipment were killed immediately. Requests for rest were ignored. Rain continued without relief. The column diminished rapidly. Some prisoners reached Ranao, but survival there was temporary. No proper camp existed. Shelter was improvised. Food remained scarce. Hard labor resumed almost immediately, despite the men's condition. Death from starvation and disease continued at high rates. A final group remained at Sandakan. Approximately 75 prisoners deemed too ill to move. On June 9, 1945, even they were forced onto the trail. Most could not travel far. Within days, they collapsed and were executed or left to die. By mid-June, organized columns had ceased to exist. Only scattered individuals remained alive along the route or at Ranao. In total, of the 2,434 prisoners who had left Sandakan during the 3 marches, only a small number ever reached the inland clearing. None of those would survive to the end of the war in captivity. The attrition was systematic. The marches had not served a logistical function. They had reduced the prisoner population to near zero without a single centralized massacre. Amid this collapse, a handful of men began considering a different option: escape into terrain that had already killed hundreds. For most, the opportunity never came. For 6, it did. By June 1945, the marches had broken apart into fragments of men moving through jungle under armed guard. Among them was Private Keith Botterill. On the night of 7th June, during a halt deep inland, Botterill assessed what remained of his strength. He weighed little more than 85 pounds. Dysentery had drained him. Ulcers covered his legs. Fever came in waves. Yet concealed in his clothing were folded scraps of paper. Names, dates, descriptions of killings, evidence gathered at risk of immediate execution. He understood that remaining in the column meant certain death. The guards rotated in predictable intervals. Rain fell heavily that night, reducing visibility. After counting patrol movements, Botterill moved. He lowered himself into mud and crawled away from the perimeter. Each motion tore at infected flesh. For several minutes, he heard nothing but rainfall. Then shouts, a flare of light, gunfire into darkness. He did not turn back. He ran until his legs failed, then crawled again, pushing through undergrowth until the sounds faded. By dawn, he was alone in dense jungle, disoriented and without supplies. For days he moved eastward, guided by terrain and instinct. Food was limited to insects, roots, and occasional fallen fruit. Water came from streams regardless of contamination. Fever blurred judgment. Several times he collapsed and expected not to wake. He kept the papers dry as best he could. Another prisoner, Nelson Short, chose a different moment. During the second march, after falling on a steep incline, Short was struck repeatedly by a guard. Instead of resisting, he allowed his body to go limp. The column moved on, assuming him dead or dying. He remained motionless for hours, aware that patrols might return. When darkness fell and the trail was silent, he pulled himself into undergrowth and began moving away from the path. Japanese search parties were dispatched. Short later recalled hearing voices and boots passing close to where he lay concealed. He avoided established trails and followed waterways when possible, knowing trackers would expect him to remain near the route. The terrain offered no comfort. Swamps slowed progress to meters per hour. Leeches attached in clusters. Rivers required crossing without strength to swim effectively. Yet distance from the marchers increased with each day. 4 other men, Owen Campbell, Richard Braithwaite, Bill Moxham, and Andy Anderson, escaped at separate points during early June. Each departure required timing and calculation. Some slipped away during storms. Others broke from columns at moments of confusion. None possessed maps. All were severely malnourished. Their survival depended on local inhabitants. Indigenous communities in Borneo had endured Japanese occupation under threat of reprisal. Assistance to escapees carried risk of execution. Nevertheless, in several instances, villagers provided shelter, food, and information. Word was sent quietly to Allied guerrilla units operating in the interior. By late July, Japanese forces were aware that prisoners had disappeared. Search efforts increased. Patrols moved along likely routes. Orders emphasized that escapees must not reach Allied lines. Meanwhile, Allied commanders in the region had limited information about Sandakan. Intelligence suggested prisoners were held somewhere in Borneo, but details of the marches were unknown. In the final week of July, Botterill collapsed near a village clearing. He was discovered by local residents who chose concealment over betrayal. After days of recovery, contact was made with Australian Special Operations personnel. Short reached Allied-linked fishermen along the coast in early August. He was transported to guerrilla positions and then to Australian units. One by one, the remaining escapees emerged from jungle into areas held or influenced by Allied forces. Their physical condition was critical. Medical staff recorded extreme malnutrition, infected wounds, and psychological trauma. Yet they spoke immediately of the others, of thousands left behind. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced surrender. At Ranau, a small number of surviving prisoners remained alive under guard. In the hours following news of capitulation, those prisoners were executed. Records were destroyed. Camps were burned. The 6 who had escaped weeks earlier survived by a narrow margin of time. Had they remained, they would have been among the final dead. Instead, they carried testimony. Their survival altered the historical record. In early September 1945, Australian forces entered Sandakan. They expected to locate surviving prisoners. Instead, they found an abandoned site. The barracks stood empty. Cooking areas were cold. Shallow graves were visible beyond the perimeter. Burned documents lay scattered in ash. Investigators quickly understood that the camp had held thousands. They began tracing the inland route described by the 6 escapees. Patrols moved toward Borneo, documenting remains along the way. Scattered bones, fragments of clothing, and makeshift graves appeared at intervals consistent with a forced march. Villagers confirmed that columns of emaciated prisoners had passed months earlier. Many had collapsed. Guards had shot those unable to continue. At Borneo, the final clearing was located. Little infrastructure remained. The area showed signs of recent burning. Mass graves were identified. No prisoners were alive. The scale of loss became clear through comparison of camp records, survivor testimony, and forensic examination. Of the 2,434 Australian and British prisoners held at Sandakan between 1942 and 1945, all but 6 were dead. The 6 survivors were evacuated for treatment. Keith Botterill required months of hospitalisation. His concealed notes were preserved and later submitted as evidence. They contained specific names of guards, descriptions of executions, and details of conditions within the camp. Investigators compared his account with that of Nelson Short and the other escapees. Their testimonies aligned on dates, locations, and methods. The psychological impact was severe. Several survivors experienced persistent nightmares, anxiety, and withdrawal. Post-traumatic stress was not yet formally recognized, but symptoms were evident. Some chose public testimony as a means of purpose. Others avoided discussion entirely. Between 1946 and 1948, war crimes trials were conducted, including proceedings in Rabaul. Captain Hoshijima Susumu, Commandant of Sandakan, was charged with responsibility for the deaths of prisoners under his authority. Evidence included survivor testimony and documentary material captured from Japanese units. He was convicted and later executed. Additional officers and guards faced prosecution. Some received death sentences. Others were imprisoned. Not all perpetrators were identified or located. The official count recorded 2,060 Australian and 374 British prisoners held at Sandakan. Total deaths equaled 2,428 men. Survival rate was less than 1/4%. No British prisoner survived. For Australia, the loss represented the largest single wartime disaster involving its servicemen during the Second World War. Yet public attention in the immediate post-war years often centred on European campaigns. The events in Borneo remained less widely known outside military and veteran communities. Over time, memorialisation efforts increased. The former campsite became Sandakan Memorial Park in Sabah, Malaysia. Names of the dead are inscribed there. Annual commemorations on August 15th mark the date of Japan's surrender and acknowledge those who perished during the marches. The 6 survivors lived varied post-war lives. Some engaged with veterans organisations. Others withdrew from public attention. All carried the memory of men who had not returned. The historical significance of Sandakan extended beyond numbers. The marches demonstrated deliberate policy rather than accidental neglect. They revealed how administrative decisions, combined with indifference to human life, could result in near-total extermination without a single formal massacre order recorded. They also demonstrated the importance of testimony. Had none escaped, documentation would have been limited to destroyed records and scattered graves. The narrative might have remained incomplete. Instead, detailed accounts preserved facts sufficient for legal proceedings and historical record. The impact reached into military policy and international law discussions regarding treatment of prisoners. Sandakan became cited as a case study in war crimes education and remembrance. The final reflection returns to January 1945. Prisoners once stood in rain at Sandakan, unaware of the calculations made about their fate. Most would disappear along jungle trails. 6 did not. Their survival did not reverse what happened. It did not restore the thousands lost. It ensured, however, that the events would be recorded accurately, investigated formally, and remembered publicly. Sandakan stands as evidence that even when systems attempt to erase witnesses, individual persistence can preserve truth. They were supposed to disappear, all of them, without witnesses, without graves, without anyone knowing what happened in the jungles of Borneo. The Japanese almost succeeded. Almost. But 6 men, starving, dying, with odds of survival statistically near zero, chose to resist extinction. Because they survived, the story endured. And because it endured, the dead were not erased.